This is a true story, but the names of the characters have been changed. Welcome to a tale of family, love, and betrayal. Jack believed he had it all, a loving family and a devoted wife, until hidden secrets shattered his world. Those he trusted most had built their lives with him on lies and betrayal. Now, Jack must confront painful truths and face whether the truth can truly bring peace. My name is Jack, born and raised in New York City, the city that never sleeps. It's the kind of place where anyone, with a bit of grit and luck, can make something out of nothing. Back when I was younger, I never thought I'd make it this far. My family wasn't wealthy. My dad held down a modest civil service job, and my mom worked in a small shop. Every day revolved around school and whatever part-time jobs I could pick up, all in the hopes that I'd one day break out of an ordinary life and actually build something bigger. As time went by, I found myself leaning toward business. I took a chance and started a few small companies, building things up gradually. It wasn't easy, nothing ever is, but thanks to taking some big risks at the right times and having a bit of luck, I eventually carved out a steady career. Those years of grinding away gave me what people often dream of: financial security, a solid reputation, and the respect of those around me. From the outside looking in, my life might have seemed almost perfect, a life I know not everyone could easily achieve. By that point, though, I was living a pretty closed-off life. Career-wise, I was set, but I hadn't gotten married. Honestly, I didn't feel the need. My past relationships had mostly been fleeting, partly because of my packed work schedule and partly because I just hadn't met anyone who made me want to commit for the long haul. Then came the day I met Sarah. At first, she was just a maid, the young woman from a distant, small town. Sarah had this gentle, unassuming presence and a bit of a wide-eyed look, like someone who hadn't really been around a lot of luxury before. Each time I passed by her, I'd notice her gaze linger on things with a hint of curiosity, maybe even a quiet longing. It was the kind of look I understood immediately, because I'd once had it too, a hunger to break free from limits and reach for something bigger. To be honest, at that time, I didn't pay much attention to Sarah. She quietly went about her work, never complaining, never trying to get close to me or anyone else in the house. Strangely enough, it was probably that very quality that made her stand out. I think I felt a sort of unspoken empathy for her, like seeing a version of myself in her, wanting a different life but not quite there yet. So I started noticing her more, making small talk here and there, checking in on her work, and somewhere along the line, without even realizing it, I began to care about her in a special way. Life has its ways, and things began to shift. Even though I'd always been methodical in my business decisions, thinking each one through, this time I found myself going with my emotions. Sarah came into my life unexpectedly, stirring something in me I couldn't ignore. At first, I thought it was just a passing affection. But over time, Sarah and I became closer. I'd often remind myself that this was just something casual, nothing deep, yet that wasn't how it turned out. Those brief conversations, the quiet glances, or just sitting together without a word, all these little moments began binding me to Sarah in a way I hadn't felt before. Things took a big turn when Sarah told me she was pregnant. I was honestly stunned. I felt everything at once: confusion, worry, and a sudden sense of responsibility. Until that moment, I'd always thought I had a firm grip on life, but this news forced me to confront a decision that felt much bigger than anything before. For the first time, I started seriously thinking about marriage and having a child, which I'd never really pictured as essential parts of my life. I remember the night she told me how hesitant she was, nervously fiddling with the hem of her shirt, avoiding eye contact. It was a strange mix of emotions, part joy, part disbelief. Sarah didn't demand anything or insist that I take responsibility, but her eyes spoke volumes. I knew I had to do the right thing and marry her. When I married Sarah, it felt more like the logical, responsible choice rather than an act of deep love. My feelings for her then weren't fiery or passionate, more a quiet attachment, partly out of responsibility to our unborn child, partly from a sort of empathy towards Sarah herself. She'd come into my life so quietly, so selflessly. Yet as the months went on, living together slowly reshaped how I saw her. I realized Sarah wasn't like anyone I'd ever met. She never demanded anything, never asked for more than I could give. She just lived beside me, quietly, taking care of everything. Some nights, after a long day at work, I'd come home to find her waiting with a simple meal, thoughtfully prepared. Sarah had this way of making our large house feel warm and familiar, softening that loneliness I hadn't even known I felt. And when Nikki was born, everything changed completely. Watching that little baby in Sarah's arms, I felt something settle inside me. It wasn't just responsibility anymore, it was real love, something I hadn't known before. From the moment he was born, Nikki brought a different outlook on family into my life. Mornings became something to look forward to, even if it was just playing with Nikki for a few minutes before heading out. And when he started smiling, his laughter became the sound I looked forward to the most. The thing I'll remember forever is how Sarah cared for Nikki. There were nights when he'd start crying, and I'd pretend to be asleep just to see how she handled it. I'd watch her gently soothe him, singing softly, rocking him without a trace of frustration. The patience and tenderness she showed with him really moved me. At that moment, I realized Sarah wasn't just the mother of my son, she was someone who had become an inseparable part of my life. Living with Sarah gradually changed me. We shared moments that warmed me in a way I hadn't experienced before. I remember our first Christmas after Nikki was born. Sarah decorated the house with such care, making sure everything was just right. She got a small Christmas tree and invited me and Nikki to help decorate it together. Seeing the excitement in Nikki's eyes as the lights sparkled filled me with a simple happiness I'd never felt before. Over time, I realized I'd begun to love Sarah naturally, almost without noticing. Sometimes, when she'd be busy with Nikki, I'd find myself just watching the two of them, feeling incredibly lucky. What I once thought of as a reluctant marriage had now become something I couldn't imagine my life without. As Nikki got a bit older, we moved into a larger house, a place that felt like a dream come true. I thought I finally had it all, a loving family, a home I could be proud of, and a happy life with Sarah and our son, Nikki. Those first days in the new house were peaceful. I'd go to work, and Sarah would take care of the house and look after Nikki. The place was always tidy, the garden meticulously kept. I truly felt at ease, believing I had a real home to come. From time to time, I'd have to travel for work, sometimes for several days. My business kept me busy, but I'd do everything I could to finish my tasks quickly so I could get back to Sarah and Nikki as soon as possible. Every time I returned, Sarah would greet me with a bright smile, and Nikki would come running to hug my legs. Those moments were simple but warm, reassuring me that everything was all right at home. Yet, there were things going on that I didn't know about. Behind my back, whenever I was away, it wasn't just Sarah and Nikki in that big house. Robert, our longtime house manager whom I trusted to look after the place, was showing up more than I'd realized. At first, Sarah told me Robert was just coming by to check on the house and garden, helping out whenever needed. I didn't think twice about it. To me, Robert was a reliable fixture, someone who knew every corner of the house. But as it turned out, whenever I was away on business, Sarah and Robert were meeting much more often than necessary. They weren't just talking about house matters as Sarah had assured me. I didn't realize that while I was away, Robert would be there for hours, sometimes even staying the night, supposedly helping Sarah with tasks she said were needed to keep the house in perfect condition. One time, while I was in Chicago for work, my trip got extended by 2 days due to a major contract negotiation. Sarah assured me that she and Nikki were doing fine and told me to stay focused on my work. But while I was gone, Sarah was seeing Robert far more often than I'd imagined. They'd sit together in the garden, talking intimately without any sense of concern, as though no one would notice. She had things arranged so only a few close staff members ever saw them, and of course, no one dared say a word to me. Some nights, Robert would even stay for dinner with Sarah, in the same room I always thought of as our family's gathering space. They'd sit there, eating, laughing, like there wasn't any boundary between them. After dinner, Sarah would make tea for both of them, and they'd sit by the window, looking out at the garden, the same one I'd carefully designed. Those quiet, private moments happened every time I was away, turning our home into a place I no longer fully understood, where things happened beyond my view. Over time, my business trips became more and more of an opportunity for Sarah and Robert to spend time together. I had no idea that, during these absences, I was leaving a space behind, one that Sarah silently filled with Robert's presence. Looking back, I should have noticed the signs much earlier. There were things happening right in front of me, but I was too caught up in work to pay attention. Big contracts, endless meetings, and the pressures of being in charge left me focused on my career. I'd tell myself that Sarah had everything handled at home, that our life was solid and I didn't need to sweat the small stuff. But over time, odd things started piling up, and I still refused to see them clearly. There was one time when Emma, the maid who had worked for us so long she knew the house inside and out, came to talk to me. She hesitated, clearly reluctant to say what she had on her mind. Emma mentioned that she'd noticed some unusual behavior between Sarah and Robert. She didn't give details, just said that whenever I was away, Sarah and Robert seemed to spend a lot of time alone together. Sometimes, they'd talk for hours in the back garden, or even have dinner together. I just laughed it off, telling Emma that she was probably reading too much into things, that maybe Sarah just needed to talk business with Robert. But Emma looked genuinely worried. She told me, with as much sincerity as she could, that it didn't seem like just work. Emma went on to describe a particular afternoon, right after I'd left for a business trip. She had seen Sarah and Robert standing very close to each other out in the yard. There was something different in the way they looked at each other, not the kind of look you'd expect between an employer and a manager. But I brushed it off, even reminding Emma that she shouldn't interfere with the personal matters of the family. Then another time, I came home earlier than expected from a trip to Boston. I noticed a few things that seemed off. The living room lights were on, even though it was late, and Sarah was sitting on the couch. But as soon as she heard my car, she got up quickly, looking a bit startled. When I asked about Robert, she just said he'd left a while ago after finishing some work outside. I didn't think much of it at the time and figured she was just surprised by my early arrival. Still, somewhere deep down, a hint of doubt lingered that I didn't want to face. There were also times I'd get strange calls from unfamiliar numbers. The callers would hesitate, not saying much before abruptly hanging up. Once, while I was at the office late in the afternoon, Emma called to let me know that a strange man had come to the house looking for Sarah. I found it odd, but when I asked Sarah, she just told me it was an old friend dropping by to say hello. I wasn't sure what to think but decided to believe her. The signs kept coming, but exhausted from work and firmly believing in my family, I ignored them all. I convinced myself there was no way anything could be wrong in my home, the one place I'd worked so hard to build and protect. Sarah and I had shared so many good times together, playing with Nikki in the evenings, spending cozy weekends as a family. Everything I saw on the surface looked perfect, and I didn't want to believe that anything could threaten that happiness. In the end, all those warnings felt like a passing breeze. I clung to the calm front I'd built, trying not to let Emma's words get to me. But deep down, something had started to grow, a feeling of unease that, no matter how hard I tried to push away, I couldn't entirely silence. Things got a lot more serious when Emma, my loyal housekeeper, had an accident. One evening, shortly after I returned from a business trip, I was told that Emma had fallen from the second-floor balcony and died on the spot. Hearing that Emma had passed, it felt like something inside me collapsed. Emma had been with my family from the early days when we first moved into the estate. She was the one person I trusted completely with everything. She wasn't just dedicated, she looked after every little detail around the house and helped take care of my family whenever I was away. She knew every corner of the place, from the kitchen to the hidden pathways in the garden. Without her, the house felt emptier, like it had lost a certain warmth that she always brought to it. The night Emma died, the police concluded she'd fallen from the second-floor balcony. They thought maybe she'd accidentally slipped while cleaning. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Why would someone as careful as Emma have an accident like that? She'd been up and down that balcony area countless times, especially during windy days, and never had a single mishap. That thought haunted me, but there was nothing concrete to suggest anything else. A few days after the funeral, I found one of Emma's things, a light blue scarf she wore every day. It was neatly folded on her dresser in her room, as if she'd just come back from work and left it there. I remembered the look in her eyes in those last days, filled with worry, almost like she wanted to warn me about something. But now it was too late. She was gone, without a word, leaving behind only the questions and suspicions she'd taken with her. What I never expected was that, on the night of Emma's accident, her young daughter, Sam, had witnessed part of what happened without anyone knowing. Sam was only 5 at the time, quietly standing behind her bedroom door, watching as her mother left the room and walked toward the second-floor balcony. She didn't understand why her mom was going out there so late, but for a child, it was an unforgettable moment etched in her memory. She stood there, watching her mother's figure disappear down the hallway. Just minutes later, a piercing scream echoed, freezing her in place. When Sam finally ran out, she saw people frantically surrounding her mother's body on the ground below. In that moment, she lost the only parent she'd ever known. After Emma's death, a distant relative came to take Sam away, and she left the estate. She didn't say a word, didn't cry, just looked around quietly with a blank expression. But in her eyes, I saw something cold and determined, a look I would never forget. The day Sam left, she didn't look back once, just walked away in silence, clutching a doll her mother had given her shortly before passing. As time went by, I gradually pushed the whole thing to the back of my mind, assuming Emma's death was just an unfortunate accident. Life in the estate returned to its normal routine. But occasionally, on quiet nights, whenever I passed the balcony area, I felt a strange chill in the air, a sense of something lingering. Sometimes, I'd hear faint footsteps, as if someone were quietly pacing back and forth. I'd stop and listen, then brush it off as my imagination played tricks. Years later, when Sam returned to the city as an adult, I finally realized the tragedy wasn't over. It was only when she came back that I started to understand the events of the past hadn't been forgotten, they had only been waiting for the right moment to resurface. When Sam re-entered our lives, it was natural at first, almost by chance. She ran into Nikki one late afternoon at a nearby park. They both had a love for street art, and Sam encouraged Nikki to try his hand at painting a piece of graffiti on an old wall at the park, a dream of his he'd never dared to pursue, fearing how the family would react. She urged him to break free of limitations and do what he truly wanted. They sat there together until it got dark, talking about art, freedom, and dreams Nikki had never shared with anyone. When he came home late that night, he seemed unusually excited, but I chalked it up to teenage enthusiasm. Gradually, Sam started appearing more frequently, almost always wherever Nikki was. One day, I saw them at a small cafe on the corner, with Sam leaning in, listening intently as Nikki talked about little details of his life. The way she listened, the sharp, mysterious look in her eyes, it all seemed to pull Nikki into a different world, one he hadn't imagined before. After that, Nikki started asking to go out more often. He'd tell me he just wanted to spend time with friends, but deep down, I knew he was always trying to find a way to be with Sam. Sam became more than just a friend to Nikki, she became someone he trusted completely. One night, after an argument Sarah and I had with him about his schoolwork, he yelled back that we didn't understand him at all. Later, I saw him texting Sam, venting his frustrations. Sam responded in a way that seemed like she understood him better than anyone else, like she alone truly knew who he was. Slowly, Nikki started to look to Sam as a confidant, a friend who listened, someone who encouraged him to be himself without holding back. And so, Nikki began to change. He'd ask to go out at night to meet Sam, saying she wanted to show him special spots around the city. I refused at first, but somehow, he always found a way to sneak out. One night, I caught him climbing out his window to meet her. When I asked him what he was doing, he just met my gaze with a stubborn silence, his eyes flashing with a thrill I'd never seen before. Sam had created a secret world just for him, a world of excitement and new experiences that he couldn't find at home. Once, I walked in on Nikki sketching in his room, absorbed in finishing a graffiti piece Sam had inspired him to create. He was drawing it in a notebook, But when I came closer to take a look, he quickly hid it away, saying it was a secret between him and Sam. He'd never hidden anything from me like that before, and the way he guarded his connection with Sam made it impossible for me to ignore. Somehow, she'd made him feel special, convinced him they shared a bond unlike anything else. With Sam around, Nikki grew increasingly distant from the family. He stopped spending time with his younger sister, and he no longer wanted to join us for dinner. I remember one time Sarah called him down to eat, but he simply replied that he had plans with Sam. It was the first time I saw Sarah so disappointed. She tried to talk to Nikki, to understand his relationship with Sam, but every attempt fell flat. Nikki saw Sam as more than a friend, as a mentor, even someone to look up to. Over time, it became clear that Sam wasn't just a friend or an older sister figure to Nikki. She was subtly guiding his every move, encouraging him to do whatever she wanted without hesitation or question. Nikki trusted her completely, willing to do anything to keep her happy. The changes were too obvious for me to ignore. At that moment, I realized Sam wasn't just a simple young woman. She was someone with a purpose, someone who had a hold over my son in a way I hadn't foreseen. Slowly, Sarah also realized that Nikki's relationship with Sam had grown into something far from a normal friendship. Nikki was increasingly under Sam's influence, willing to do whatever she wanted. Sarah tried to talk to him, hoping to understand what was going on between them. But her attempts didn't go anywhere. Whenever she brought it up, Nikki would get irritated, even snapping that she didn't understand his life. Sarah's worry deepened. One night, she happened to catch Nikki sneaking out of the house. She stood by the window and watched as he met Sam down the street. Together, they disappeared into the night, completely unaware of Sarah's watchful eyes. The next morning, when she asked Nikki about it, he answered casually, saying that Sam had taken him to a special place but didn't share any more details. This left Sarah even more uneasy, unsure of what was really going on between them. Another time, Sarah tried to forbid Nikki from seeing Sam. She told him that Sam wasn't a good friend and that she was worried about the changes she was seeing in him. But Nikki exploded with anger, shouting that Sam was the only person who understood him, the only one who gave him freedom and acceptance. He even told Sarah that she was the one holding him back. Sarah was heartbroken hearing this, but she also felt helpless, realizing she had lost her connection to the son she'd loved and raised with all her heart. I started to notice how serious things were getting. One evening during dinner, I watched Nikki, who was glued to his phone, texting Sam the entire time without looking up. Sarah tried to engage him in conversation, but he barely responded, finally leaving the table as soon as he was finished eating. This wasn't the son I once knew. Nikki used to be eager to share stories about school with the whole family. Now, he was closed off, his attention fixated on his talks with Sam. Sarah and I decided to look deeper into who Sam really was. We asked around, but nobody seemed to know much about her. Sam had no obvious family connections, no close friends aside from Nikki, and her background was almost entirely hidden from view. All we knew was that she had returned to the city a few months back and appeared to live a quiet, secluded life. The more I looked into her, the more I realized that Sam wasn't who she seemed in Nikki's eyes. She was someone with a complicated past that I couldn't fully piece together. It began to dawn on me that none of this was random. Sam's return, her powerful influence over Nikki, and the way she seemed to direct his every move, these felt like pieces of a plan that had been in motion for a long time. That night, I sat alone in my study, going over memories and small details I had ignored before, a chill running down my spine. I remembered Emma's warnings, her mysterious death, and the doubts I had once brushed aside. I knew I couldn't sit by any longer. I had to find out what Sam's true purpose was and her intentions with Nikki. I couldn't let my son be drawn into something I didn't fully understand. Sam hadn't come back into our lives to be a friend. She was here for something else, something I still couldn't see. Now I knew I had to investigate everything all over again, from Emma's death to Sam's past and the real reason she had returned. As I sat with growing anxiety, I couldn't shake the feeling of what might happen if I didn't act soon. When I decided to start watching Nikki and Sam, I never imagined I'd uncover such a devastating truth. At first, I only meant to understand what Sam was doing to influence my son. I quietly installed a tracker on Nicky's phone, noting each time he left the house at odd hours. Then, one evening, I saw them sitting together at the park near our home, their usual meeting spot. From a distance, I couldn't make out their conversation, but Nicky's face told me more than words could. He looked shocked, angry, and hurt all at once. I saw Sam place a gentle hand on his shoulder, saying something that made Nicky suddenly stand, his face tense with emotion. At that moment, I felt I should step in, but I held back, not wanting to reveal that I was there, watching. When we got home, I knew I had to figure out what Sam had told him. Searching through a few messages I managed to glimpse on Nicky's phone, I started piecing together what had unfolded. Sam had told Nicky a painful secret, that it was his mother, Sarah, who was indirectly responsible for her mother's death, Emma, our longtime housekeeper. Sam revealed to Nicky that Emma's death hadn't been a simple accident, it was the result of betrayal, lies, and hidden motives within our family. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat alone in my study, poring over old files, notes I had from the time Emma passed. The more I dug, the more disturbing the truths that surfaced. I began connecting vague details I had once ignored, moments where Sarah had hidden things from me, secrets I'd been blind to. And then I uncovered an even more devastating truth: Nicky wasn't my biological son. At first, I didn't want to believe it. I kept telling myself I had misinterpreted something or that I was reading too much into it. But as I matched each piece of information, I realized I couldn't deny it any longer. Piece by piece, I found undeniable proof that Nicky was Sarah's son with Robert, the house manager I'd once trusted so completely. Everything started coming into focus. Sarah had taken advantage of my trust and affection, using me as a means to gain the status and wealth she'd always wanted. The feeling of betrayal consumed me every moment. All those years I thought I was building a happy family turned out to be a lie orchestrated by Sarah. She deceived me from the very beginning, using me as a means to gain the lavish life she always craved. Finding out that the son I'd loved with all my heart wasn't actually my own nearly shattered me. That night, I sat alone in my office, staring at the family photos hanging on the wall. Pictures of us, me, Sarah, and Nicky, on vacations, holiday gatherings, moments I thought were genuine. Looking at them, I couldn't stop thinking about the years I'd sacrificed and the devotion I'd given. I'd poured my youth, commitment, and trust into this family and into a wife I thought was a true partner. But the truth was more brutal than anything I could have imagined. Sarah hadn't just deceived me about her love, she had destroyed the most sacred belief I held, my bond as a father to Nicky. I got up and walked down the hall, looking into each room of the house I'd worked so hard to build for my family. Everything here was the product of my own effort and dedication. But now, it felt like an empty shell, a house with no meaning. I knew I couldn't live in this lie any longer, couldn't face Sarah every day without feeling the sting of betrayal. The next morning, I sat across from Sarah in the living room and handed her divorce papers. I looked at her, fighting to keep my anger and hurt in check. She looked shocked, her eyes widening as she saw the papers. She tried to defend herself, to explain that things weren't as simple as I thought. But I didn't want to hear any more from her. Everything I had once needed, once trusted, had been shattered by her. In the end, I told Sarah she had to leave the house. I didn't want to see her for another moment. She left, walking away from a marriage I had once thought was real but that had become a stain on my life. As for Nicky, even though it pained me, I knew I couldn't keep him as the heir to this family. The truth wouldn't allow me to continue pretending. It was a hard decision, but the only one I could make to preserve what was left of my honor and self-respect. With the truth exposed, Sarah had nowhere left to turn. Years of deceit and manipulation had finally driven her to the edge, and I saw the fear in her eyes as her lies unraveled. She tried to avoid taking responsibility, but the evidence was against her, and no one believed her weak excuses anymore. The only person who remained loyal to her was Robert, the house manager who had been with us for so many years. In a final act of desperation, Robert, who loved Sarah and had allowed himself to be used for her gain, stepped forward to take the blame for everything. He confessed, claiming it was all his idea, that he had orchestrated everything from the beginning. He admitted to being responsible for Emma's death, hiding the truth for years. I knew he was doing this out of blind love for Sarah. By this point, I no longer recognized the Robert I had once trusted. He had been my reliable house manager, supporting me since the early days of my career, but now that loyalty had turned him into a pawn in Sarah's dark plans. Robert was eventually arrested, and a few years later, he died in prison from a serious illness. With Robert gone, Sarah was left alone to face the consequences of her actions. After his death, she seemed to lose all the strength she once had. In the months that followed, I heard that Sarah's life spiraled downwards, her mental state deteriorating. She lived in torment, haunted by memories of her betrayal and the terrible choices she'd made. Every scheme, every plan she had once believed would lead to a dream life, had become a double-edged sword that cut deep into her. Not long after, Sarah was placed in a psychiatric facility, spending her final days in isolation and madness, with a vacant look in her eyes, unable to recognize the reality around her. As for Sam, once everything was over, I could see that she didn't find peace, even after all she had done. She had avenged her mother, exposed Sarah's true nature, and torn apart our family, yet in her eyes, there was an emptiness. I'd often see Sam standing just outside the gate, looking off into the distance, as if lost in thought. She would stand there, quietly staring at the house, where it had all started, now just an empty shell of a family that had once seemed like something out of a dream. I knew Sam had real feelings for Nikki. At first, maybe it was just part of her plan, a way to get revenge, but eventually, she grew to truly care for him. I don't think she had expected that. She'd been torn between love and hatred, and now, with her mission complete, she was left with only emptiness and regret. Sometimes, from afar, I'd watch her standing still, her gaze fixed on the mansion with a look that seemed full of remorse, as if wondering if there was any way to undo what had happened, to take back all that had been done. Sam was no longer that impulsive, naive girl, but her revenge hadn't given her any joy or freedom. Once, I saw her quietly place a hand on the estate's gate, her eyes filled with longing, as if searching for the warmth that used to be there. Watching her from a distance, I could feel her inner struggle. For a moment, I saw her close her eyes, as if wishing she could erase the painful memories. But memories don't simply vanish. They stayed with Sam, reminding her of every decision and mistake she had chosen. Sam had carried out her plan, but now, standing in front of that empty mansion, I wondered if she had ever found peace. She had destroyed my family, but she'd lost everything as well. And I found myself wondering if, in those faraway looks of hers, there was regret. If she could turn back time, would she choose a different path, one where she could have found real happiness and love with Nikki, without the burden of past resentment? Both Sam and I stood before an overwhelming loss. We had both lost the chance for a family that could have been a refuge in our lives. And I realized that sometimes, truth, as painful as it is all we're left with to face ourselves. When everything was finally over, I didn't feel relief or peace. Instead, there was a hollowness I couldn't quite describe. In the months that followed, the estate became a silent, empty place, once filled with life, once the sanctuary I thought I'd built. Each room, each hallway, now held only traces of memories and mistakes I could never undo. Sometimes, I'd sit alone in the living room, looking out at the garden that Sarah once tended with care. The place looked the same, but I knew I had lost things that would never return. Every breeze that swept through the house reminded me of Nikki and Sam, kids who should have found joy and peace but were swept up in a storm they never should have faced. I wondered what their futures would be like after everything they had gone through. On some days, I'd spot Sam across the street, standing quietly, her eyes lingering on the estate, with maybe a faint glimmer of hope in them. She was as beautiful as ever, but a sadness always seemed to shadow her, a scar on her soul that might never heal. She had achieved her revenge, but now I sensed that she was questioning it, perhaps regretting it. I'd occasionally see her walk through the gate, head to the backyard, and touch the flowers her mother once tended so lovingly. she'd stand there for a long time, as if speaking to the past, trying to find brief moments of peace in her own memories. As for Nicky, though I'd made the decision to remove him from the family inheritance, I couldn't completely cut off the love I'd once had for the son I cherished. He left, moved to another city, trying to rebuild his life. I'd hear news about him from friends, and I knew he was working hard to find stability again. I hope that, with time, he'll find the peace we all lost. Nicky deserves a fresh start, somewhere untouched by the past, where he can live free of the burdens we adults placed upon him. Weekends now, I often sit in front of the open door to the garden, gazing at the familiar landscape that has changed so deeply in my eyes. Sometimes, I wonder how things might have turned out if they'd gone differently, if I'd discovered the truth sooner, if I'd listened to Emma, if I'd questioned Sarah from the start. But life doesn't let us go back, doesn't allow us to change what's already happened. And now, I have to live with the hollowness, with the memory of a family lost. There are nights I dream of another version of this life, one where everyone is happy and whole. In those dreams, Nicky is a carefree kid, Sam is a young woman enjoying life with her friends, and Sarah is a devoted mother, a trustworthy wife. But when I wake up, I find myself alone in this empty house, with nothing but memories and a regret that never fades. The story may have ended, but the scars remain, etched deep in my mind, and they will likely never fade. I can only hope that, one day, Sam and Nicky will find a place where they truly belong, a place free of revenge, free of deception, filled with peace and safety. And I, in the silence of my remaining days, will carry the lessons I learned far too late. In the emptiness, perhaps I can find some comfort in knowing I've finally come to understand the true meaning of love and honesty, though I paid a high price for that understanding.